From the Salem witch trials to modern-day exorcisms, the idea of demonic possession has been used to explain some of the most heinous crimes in history. But what happens when the line between faith and mental illness becomes blurred and the accused point to the devil as the one who made them do it? Join us as we take a look into the cases of those who claim to be possessed by demons and explore the disturbing crimes they committed in the name of the devil. Is it truly the work of Satan, or simply a way to avoid responsibility for unspeakable acts? Join us as we try to uncover the truth behind the chilling phrase, "The devil made me do it." The Uber driver and the devil app. On a fateful day in Kalamazoo County, Michigan, chaos and tragedy struck as Uber driver Jason Brian Dalton went on a shooting spree, leaving 6 people dead and 2 others injured. It was a night that the people of Kalamazoo would never forget. Dalton's violent rampage began when he shot and seriously injured a woman in a parking lot before proceeding to a car dealership where he killed 2 people and injured another. But the worst was yet to come. Dalton then drove to a Cracker Barrel restaurant where he opened fire, killing 4 people and injuring another before fleeing the scene. During his interrogation, Dalton made a bizarre and disturbing claim that the Uber app on his phone had taken control of him and directed him to carry out the shootings. Dalton claimed that he'd seen the symbol of the Eastern Star when he initially logged into the Uber app. "I just tapped it, and then there was like a devil head that popped up," Dalton told investigators in the tapes. "It was some sort of like horned head, like a cow head or something. I pressed that button, and that's where all the problems went after that." This led to a media frenzy and speculation about the potential risks of allowing individuals with a history of mental illness or violent behavior to work as Uber drivers. Despite his claims, Dalton was found competent to stand trial, and in January 2019, he pleaded guilty to all charges against him. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The Dark Descent of Sean Sellers. At the young age of 16, Sean Sellers had already embraced a dark path in life. He was a practicing Satanist who regularly drank his own blood. Born to a 16-year-old mother and an alcoholic father in California, Sellers' father abandoned the family when Sean was just 3 years old. Sean's childhood was a tumultuous one, marked by an early struggle with mental health issues that he was unable to understand. At the age of 6, he began to hear voices in his head and experiencing mood swings, episodes of paranoia, and periods of deep depression. But it wasn't until he was 8 years old that he stumbled upon something that would set him on a path towards darkness. His babysitter's books on Satanism fascinated him, and soon he was reading every book he could find on the topic. Regrettably, Sean's family life was similarly disordered. Vonda, his mother, toiled long hours as a truck driver and was absent for extended periods, leaving him in the care of relatives. Sean alleged that he experienced both verbal and physical maltreatment from his mother and grandfather. According to him, one of his uncles would even humiliate him by forcing him to wear soiled diapers on his head, an act that was made worse by the fact that Sean wet the bed until the age of 13. He subsequently recounted to a psychiatrist an incident where his uncle placed an axe on a wounded raccoon's head and pulled on its legs until its head detached. Sean's uncle frequently referred to him as a wimp when he refused to take part in the cruel acts. In an attempt to establish some stability in Sean's life, his mother wed Paul Bellafato, a decorated Vietnam War veteran and fellow truck driver. However, as per Sean's account, he was frequently reprimanded by his stepfather. The family moved 30 times by the time Sean turned 16, before finally settling in Oklahoma City. By this time, Sean was increasingly becoming involved in Satanism and taking amphetamines. On the night of March 5th, 1986, wearing only a pair of black underwear, Sean crept into his parents' bedroom and shot both of them in the face. Sean later confessed that before killing his parents, he lit candles, poured blood into a chalice on a makeshift altar, and began an invocation. At his trial, the defense blamed the shootings on the occult, claiming Sellers had become addicted to Satanism and the game Dungeons and Dragons and had lost touch with reality. But the police, and ultimately the jury, concluded that the murders of the Belafatos was premeditated. Sean had stripped down to his underwear to avoid getting blood splatter on his clothes, and he tried to pose his victims in such a way as to make homicide investigators think that an unknown intruder was responsible. The planning of the murder showed that Sean was an experienced killer, which he was. A year earlier, Sean had shot and killed a Circle K convenience store clerk named Robert Paul Bauer after the clerk had refused to sell him beer. According to the testimony of Sellers' best friend, who was with him at the time of the murder, Sellers said that he killed the store clerk because he wanted to see what it feels like to kill somebody. Sean never hid the fact that he was responsible for all 3 murders. Convicted and sentenced to death, Sean remains the youngest criminal ever sentenced to death in America since 1976. While languishing in prison, Sean found fame as a born-again Christian and a crusader against the occult. At his trial and afterwards, Sellers maintained that he had embraced Satanism after becoming addicted to the fantasy role-playing game Dungeons and Dragons. He also claimed that he was possessed by a demonic entity at one point. Sean became a fixture on television shows and conducted interviews with Geraldo Rivera and Oprah Winfrey. In these interviews, he often spoke as an expert on Satanism and occult practices. On February 3, 1999, the state of Oklahoma finally carried out the death sentence that it had promised 13 years before. 2 days before his death, a petulant Sellers complained in his jailhouse diary that people kept bringing up the 1985 and 1986 murders. He wrote, "I'm amazed at the self-righteousness I still encounter from people who don't even know me. People, for one moment, get your eyes off my own sins and look at your own. You want to harp on something that happened 13 years ago. 13 years. Sellers finished his diary by stating that he had repented for his sins and had served God ever since. The Demon Murder Case. Brookfield, Connecticut had been a peaceful and beloved haven for over a century until February 16, 1981, when a brutal murder shattered the town's tranquility. Alan Bono was the victim, stabbed over 20 times with a pocket knife. However, what happened next was beyond anyone's imagination. In May 1980, Arne Cheyenne Johnson moved into his fiancée Debbie Glatzel's home in Brookfield, Connecticut. Shortly after, Debbie's 11-year-old brother David Glatzel began claiming he was being haunted by a demon after encountering a supposedly possessed well. David would wake up in tears, describing visions of a man with big black eyes, a thin face with animal features and jagged teeth, pointed ears, horns, and hoofs. The Glatzel family sought help from the Catholic Church, but to no avail. The nightmares persisted, and David started experiencing scratches and bruises all over his body. Desperate for help, they contacted the renowned paranormal investigators and demonologists Ed and Lorraine Warren. The Warrens conducted 4 minor rites of exorcism in an attempt to rid David of the 42 demons supposedly possessing him. According to the Warrens, during 3 subsequent exorcisms led by priests, David levitated, cursed, and even stopped breathing. In the midst of one of the exorcisms, Johnson was unable to bear the agony that the demonic entity was inflicting on David and made an audacious move. He dared the demons to leave David and possess him instead. On that fateful day of February 16, 1981, Johnson was feeling unwell and decided to call in sick to his job. Instead, he accompanied his fiancée, Debbie, her sister Wanda, and her cousin Mary at the kennel where they worked. But things quickly took a turn for the worse when they went out to lunch with their employer and landlord, Alan Bono. After a few too many drinks, Bono's behavior became increasingly erratic, culminating in a horrifying moment when he grabbed Debbie and refused to let go. In a desperate attempt to save his girl, Johnson ordered Bono to release her. But the landlord was too drunk and too out of control to listen. Johnson, fueled by a primal instinct, turned into a snarling beast and drew a 5-inch pocket knife. The scene was chaotic, with Debbie standing between the two men, trying to break up the fight. But it was too late. Johnson, lost in a haze of rage and fear, repeatedly stabbed Bono, inflicting 4 or 5 tremendous wounds that left the landlord gasping for air. Bono died a few hours later, leaving behind a trail of blood and confusion. The aftermath was just as surreal. Johnson was found wandering aimlessly 2 miles away from the site of the killing. The day after the tragedy, the Warrens, famous paranormal investigators, claimed that Johnson was possessed by demons at the time of the crime. The media seized on the story, turning it into a sensationalized frenzy that captured the nation's attention. In October 1981, the trial of Arne Cheyenne Johnson began in Connecticut's Superior Court in Danbury. Johnson's lawyer, Martin Minella, attempted to enter a plea of not guilty by reason of demonic possession and planned to subpoena the priests who performed the exorcisms, urging them to break tradition and testify about their controversial practices. However, the presiding judge, Robert Callahan, quickly rejected this defense, arguing that it lacked evidence and was scientifically irrelevant. The defense instead tried to imply that Johnson acted in self-defense. Due to this, the jury was not allowed to consider demonic possession as a valid explanation for the killing. After 3 days of deliberation, the jury found Johnson guilty of first-degree manslaughter on November 24, 1981. He was sentenced to 10 to 20 years in prison, but only served 5. The shocking tale quickly captured the public's attention, prompting the release of a paperback book titled The Demon Murder Case and a television movie featuring Kevin Bacon and Cloris Leachman. In addition, the story served as the inspiration for the plot of the 2021 film, The Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It. Even now, almost 4 decades later, Johnson's case remains shrouded in controversy and speculation. The demonic possession of Michael Taylor. In 1974, a year after the release of the iconic horror movie, The Exorcist, the real-life tale of Michael Taylor and his possession by demons shook the town of Ossett in West Yorkshire, England. Michael Taylor, a 31-year-old father to 5 children and husband to Christine Taylor, appeared to live an idyllic life in Ossett, West Yorkshire in 1974. Described as mild-mannered and generally kind by his neighbors, he occasionally suffered from depressive episodes, which his family attributed to a back injury that caused difficulties in finding full-time employment. Although the family lived within a few miles of several churches, they rarely attended until a friend convinced Michael to join a weekly prayer meeting. It was there that Taylor met Marie Robinson, the group's preacher, who convinced her followers that the power of God could cast out their demons. Michael became increasingly enamored with Marie, attending every meeting and even engaging in private prayer sessions with her that lasted for more than 8 hours. As a result, his relationship with his family suffered, and his wife, Christine, grew suspicious of their private meetings. During the next prayer meeting they attended, Christine openly confronted Michael about his time with Marie. However, Michael's response was far from expected. He suddenly exploded with anger, directing his rage towards Marie and attacking her both verbally and physically. The intensity of his fury was so great that he continued to shout at her in tongues, even as other members of the congregation intervened to restrain him. Marie would later state, "I suddenly glanced at Mike and his whole features changed. He looked almost bestial. He kept looking at me and there was a really wild look in his eyes. I started screaming at him out of fear. I started speaking in tongues. Mike also screamed at me in tongues. I was on the verge of death, and I seemed to come to my senses." His outburst was attributed to demonic possession by a local vicar who declared that Michael needed an exorcism. Father Peter Vincent and Reverend Raymond Smith held an exorcism for Michael at St. Thomas's Church in Gauber on October 5, 1974. The prayer group was present as well. The ritual lasted for 8 grueling hours, during which Michael became violent. He thrashed, convulsed, and spat, and eventually had to be restrained to the floor of the church. The priest resorted to putting a crucifix in his mouth and drenching him with holy water. By 8 a.m. the next day, the priests were completely exhausted and were unable to complete the exorcism. They advised Michael and Christine to prepare for part 2, having expelled over 40 demons from Michael. Although they had to stop the exorcism, they comforted Michael by telling him they had only 3 demons left to banish: murder, madness, and violence. After being advised by the priest to prepare for the second part of the exorcism, Michael and Christine left the church and returned home. However, only an hour and 45 minutes after the exorcism, police patrolling the Taylors' neighborhood were confronted with a horrifying spectacle: a naked man covered in blood, wandering aimlessly through the streets. It was, in fact, Michael Taylor. In a state of panic, the officer rushed to Michael's residence only to discover that several other officers had already arrived at the scene in response to noise complaints from concerned neighbors. The officers were met with what some would later call the worst crime scene they've ever encountered. Michael had brutally attacked Christine, gouging out her eyes and tongue before ripping her face off of her skull. He then strangled the family dog. After the dog was dead, he ripped out its eyes and tore it limb from limb, throwing them around the house. The house was covered wall to ceiling in blood. After receiving medical attention at a nearby hospital, Michael was taken into custody. However, he never provided a reason for killing Christine other than simply stating, "Released. I am released. It is done. The evil in her has been destroyed." At his trial in March, Taylor was acquitted on the grounds of insanity. He was sent to Broadmoor Hospital for 2 years, then spent another 2 years in a secure ward in Bradford before being released. The colloquial phrase, "the devil made me do it," has been utilized for centuries as a justification for committing dreadful acts, especially those of a violent or homicidal nature. However, can this assertion truly serve as a valid excuse for one's actions, or is it simply a means of evading accountability? Is it conceivable that malevolent forces have the capacity to coerce someone into committing an atrocious act such as murder? Although the response remains a matter of dispute, it is evident that we must persist in examining the complexities of the human psyche, including its susceptibilities and its tremendous potential for benevolence or malevolence. It is only through such an exploration that we can aspire to prevent future occurrences of violence and establish responsibility for individuals' deeds.